What is the difference between Harris Sultan and European colonizers? What is the difference between Harris Sultan and the neocons in Washington who pushed for the murderous invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan 20 years ago and continue to agitate for human rights in the Muslim world today? What is the difference? Let's call this the colonial question. Because all the arguments Harris brings against Muslims in Afghanistan or Pakistan or anywhere else, all of those exact same arguments have been used by European colonizers historically against not only Muslims, but against Native Americans, against Africans, against Aboriginals, against the Chinese. When Harris says Muslims abuse women because they practice polygamy, that exact same argument was used by American settlers in the 18th and 19th century to dehumanize Native Americans and justify genociding them. When Harris says Muslims are barbaric because they use corporal punishments against criminals, that exact same argument was used by the European colonial empire against the African tribes they genocided. The real question is, does Harris think the colonial project was a good thing? After all, colonialism is what brought modern human rights to all these different parts of the world. The West invading and occupying the world to bring freedom and democracy isn't something that just happened in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's something that's been happening for over 200 years. If Harris thinks human rights are so amazing, then does he think it was a good thing that Africa was colonized? Or Latin America? Does he think it was a good thing that India was colonized? Wasn't it colonialism that brought his own Muslim ancestors in the subcontinent to the light of reason and human rights? So Harris, my question is simple. Clearly the world is not going to freely choose human rights. History has definitively proven that, and Afghanistan is only the most recent example. If you really want people to abandon their religions, abandon their ways of life, their cultural heritage, and replace them with human rights, you have to force them. And forcing people inevitably gets very brutal and very bloody. That's the only way. That's why the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries are soaked with the blood of non-Europeans who were killed in the name of spreading freedom and democracy. So are you going to be honest, Harris, and stand by colonialism? Look, if human rights are so wonderful as you claim, Harris, then 200 years of brutal colonialism and millions of dead must have been worth it. Why don't you own it, Harris? When you advocate human rights, you're like a chef that presents this appetizing sausage to your audience, but you aren't honest about how that sausage is made. Muslims, at least, are honest. Islam is honest that spreading Islam sometimes requires war. That's acknowledged in the Quran in the example of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And I'm not equating Muslim conquest with European colonialism, by the way, because there are major differences that we can talk about. For one, Euro-American colonialism, past and present, is genocidal, and the death counts make that very clear. But my point is, you human rights activists are not honest. You don't own up to the true horrifying nature of spreading freedom and democracy. So Harris, if human rights are so brilliant and fantastic, then be consistent. Tell us that the millions of deaths and the brutal occupations are worth it. You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right? So just own it. Stop pretending you're something you're not. You're just playing a con game. The only way you can credibly sell human rights to your audience is if you hide all these things or gloss over them. You hide the brutal history of human rights. You hide the fact that human rights destroys marriage, family, community, how it attacks every traditional way of life. You have to hide all these things because otherwise no one would buy it. And actually it would make Islam look pretty good because Islam is fighting against this human rights monster. But you can't be honest, can you, Harris? So just stop with this con game.
So what a lot of people might not realize is the history of colonialism. The colonial project began at the end of the 19th century. Specifically this kind of enlightenment, spreading civilization. This began at the beginning of the Enlightenment. Obviously the Enlightenment has roots in the Reformation that happened in the 16th century, the scientific revolution. Those things all kind of step by step led to the Enlightenment of the 1800s, the 1700s and the 1800s. But that's when the kind of idea of the white man's burden, the white man has to civilize these savages. They have to civilize these people to the light of progress and reason and science. And this was a very racist project. Okay, all of these Enlightenment thinkers were white supremacists. They weren't white nationalists. There's a difference between white supremacists and white nationalists. But the Enlightenment thinkers were white supremacists. They believed that the European race had higher IQ, had higher intellectual ability, and therefore was in the best position to do philosophy, natural philosophy, which is what can be called science now. The European mind is able to discover these empirical truths of the world. The European mind is better able to do rational investigation, such as the kind advocated by Descartes and other rationalists. So you had this kind of supremacy, and they wanted to, out of their altruism, they wanted to export this. That was the justification for a lot of the conquering, the occupation, and the brutalization in North Africa, in Egypt, in the subcontinent, in Indonesia, for Muslims, but also in North America, also in South America, also China, all across the world, Central Asia. It was all based on this kind of white supremacy. Now, I'm not saying that people today, white people today, also have that same mentality. I'm not saying that at all. In fact, they probably don't have this kind of history. They don't have this understanding of white supremacy by the Enlightenment thinkers. People like David Hume or Jeremy Bentham or Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Stuart Mill, who wrote On Liberty, this utilitarian thinker, considered this genius, great mind of libertarian, liberal philosophy. He was